But let's kick it off. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director here at the NZUS Council, and I'm joined by Leon Grice, Chairman of the Council. Welcome, Leon.
Thank you, Jordan. It's great to be here and good to meet Todd.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the first in our US election speaker series, which will be running over the next month or so, where we'll dig into just the ins and outs of the US electoral process and the contest. And I see it as it's a celebration of democracy and all its imperfection and messiness. So in terms of the structure for today, I'll introduce our guest, and then Leon and I will kick off with the Q&A, and we'll open it up for your participation. Really do encourage you to ask questions and get involved, but let's get into it with an introduction. So welcome today's speaker. He is Director of the Political Management Program at George Washington University, where he's educating the next generation of political operatives. So teaching them the most effective strategies in winning elections, advancing legislation, and impacting public opinion. So his research and writing focuses on the mass media, public opinion, the presidency, campaigns, and elections. So all of which we'll talk about today, where we'll focus on campaign strategy, polling, the impact of changing demographics, and the things that might make calling this race really difficult. So that could be things like turnout, advance voting, mail-in voting. So Todd, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. So I think the best place to start is if you could give a little overview of where you see the various races. Particularly interested in your perspective as a campaign specialist or expert, and how you're seeing those races at this point. What do you think? What you think makes this year different or interesting from a campaign perspective, and how confident would you be in calling the race, the presidential race, today?
Right. Well, number of questions there, and certainly we are in very unprecedented times, especially here in the United States, and making any sort of prognostications are certainly going to have to be taken with a grain of salt because of COVID, because we know that even though we are expecting a higher voter turnout this election, probably in the area of about 60%.
Wow.
We got that, the last time we got that was Obama's first race in 2008. And that's because the Trump voters are very enthusiastic, and the anti-Trump voters are also very enthusiastic. We've been able to see a real flowering of what we call negative partisanship here in the United States, which means that you dislike the other party more than you actually like your own party. And these negative feelings people have can be extremely important in stimulating turnout. So for those reasons, I'm expecting a high voter turnout, as it would be under most circumstances. But of course, these aren't most circumstances. We have COVID. We have another number of states. Some of them are the swing states, which I can get into, where the infection rates are going up. Many states are going up right now, even states that had, for a long time, had it under control. So I think that's really going to make a difference with what's called casting and counting, which means how people cast their votes, whether or not they're using the mail votes or if they're going in person to line up and cast their votes. Some big questions there. Also some questions with more people who are going to want to vote by mail. Will those states have the ability, the infrastructure to be able to print the ballots, to sort the ballots, to get them out, to get them returned? Our U.S. Postal Service has been sort of hamstrung during COVID as well here in the United States. So there are a lot of institutional factors that I think may make for a long, drawn-out period after the election with the counting of the absentee ballots, which we know President Trump has already tried to cast some doubt about. And the longer it takes to count those ballots, the more uncertainty there will be, and the less certain we'll be about the outcome. So I think that's a real issue. So I can talk about polls, I can talk about the swing states, I can talk about the Senate races, which I think are very, very interesting. But where would you like me to start?
Well, what are the 2 or 3 races that you are watching really closely? What are the bellwether or the indicators that you watch to get some idea of what's happening?
I'll add to that. I mean, when I was living in the States in 2016, I was watching Wisconsin, and when it fell into the blue category on election night, it was like, okay, this is going to be a Trump victory. And it seemed like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were the difference in that election. So, are there a small group of states that you're going to be watching, or is it all over the map?
I'm watching 12 particularly, but you're absolutely right. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan were the key 3 states that, frankly, the Clinton campaign didn't take very seriously. Didn't go out there, didn't campaign very hard.
Yep.
Thought she had it in the bag. Excuse me. We're not going to see that time from the Democrats this time around. They've learned their lesson. And it was a hard lesson to learn because those states were lost by a total of 80,000 votes across 3 states, which is just a rounding error. It's less than 1% in all 3 of those states. They really could have easily gone either way. A lot of that had to do with lower voter turnout in the metropolitan areas. Frankly, that's a lot of black voters for the Democrats, which are usually a real strong segment of their voting population, but also turnout of new voters. The Trump campaign made an effort to generate new voters in those states, and they did a very good job of that, and that really helped to close the gap there. So I think those are 3 really, really interesting states. Traditionally in American politics, the bellwether state is Ohio. We used to say, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. And there's a number of reasons for that, because Ohio demographically looks like the rest of the nation. It has urban areas, farm areas, suburban areas, and has a ethnic background, an educational background that really mirrors the rest of the United States. And so that's one that is always important. Ohio always goes with the winner for the past 100 elections, which is extremely interesting. So that's one I have watching. But at George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management, just this morning we finished our estimates for our presidential election prognostication, or forecast is what I'm saying. And we're doing it on 12 of the battleground states. And I can tell you what our estimates are for each of those right now.
Oh, that'd be great.
They will vary as the campaign goes on. But it's, everything's going to change. We got 100 days of campaign left, and a lot can happen. You can ask Mr. Michael Dukakis and George H.W. Bush what can happen in 100 days in a campaign, because it certainly can turn around. Generally, a swing state that we watch is Colorado, although Colorado has been trending very blue lately. I think it will stay blue. I think the Democrats are going to pick up a Senate seat there.
Yeah.
I think Hickenlooper is going to take Cory Gardner's seat there. We give Trump a 1% chance of winning that state. Now, one of the reasons for that is what's going on in Colorado is very similar to what's going on in the rest of the nation. It's becoming much more suburban, and those suburban areas are going more Democratic. They're trending that direction. The educated people in Colorado are becoming more Democratic, and women, college-educated women, are a key demographic we're looking at in this election, having voted for Trump before, but probably going to go against him as a group this time. Not as the totality of the group, but I mean as a majority of the group this time around. Also, Colorado is very emblematic of the demographic shifts going on in the country. The fact that the Latin population is really increasing, Asian population not quite as much, but also an increasing population, just greater diversity, which also means advantage for the Democrats. So Colorado is an important one. Florida, obviously, really important swing state. You probably remember the 2000 election. Florida's gone with the winner in the past few. We give Trump about a 6% chance. Also about 7% chance in Michigan. The Democrats have really been turning things around in Michigan. They have a very popular governor who's been handling the COVID crisis in a very strong way. Now, she's gotten a lot of criticism for it, but the majority of her state is really supportive of her. Wisconsin is actually trending pretty blue right now. They had the special election earlier this year. A lot of Democrats turned out and voted for that special Supreme Court seat that they had there, a lot of absentee ballots cast. And so I think that the Republicans may have worn out their welcome in Wisconsin this time around. We're giving Wisconsin about 15% chance for Trump to win there. Arizona, really trending more blue. Again, like Colorado, we're seeing a lot more diversity there. You have a very weak Senate race going on there, a very strong Democratic challenger. Probably Democrats are going to pick off a Senate seat there. Looks like that's going to go Democratic. Give about 20% chance of that. About 20% chance Pennsylvania. These are all for the incumbent. We base it on the incumbent model. North Carolina is one I'm really looking at. I'm really interested in North Carolina. North Carolina went for Obama in 2008, but it went against him in 2012. It went for Romney in 2012. And they have a very interesting race. Incumbent Tom Tillis, moderately popular, but not terribly popular. They do have a Democratic governor now. This is one of those states that's also showing some of those demographic trends we're seeing nationwide. Should be interesting. We're giving about 35% chance to the president to take that. Now we're getting into the states which are close to 40 or over 50% for these are the real swing states, I think. Georgia, the polls are trending really strong for the Democrats in Georgia. 2 Senate seats up. A special election in Georgia. Should be very interesting to watch that one. Again, more of the suburban votes. There's been a real push by the Democrats to get people registered to vote over the past 2 years in that state. As I said, Ohio, could go either way. That's in the margins. Texas is still in the margins of going either way, but slight advantage there for Trump. The polls have been really poor for President Trump lately. And Iowa, a state that has been pretty red as of late, is now also in the too close to call. Right now, our forecast has Biden at about 330 electoral votes, 60 over the 270 needed to win. We have Trump at about 146, and 62 are swinging back and forth. So the president has a long way to go if he wants to make up the hole he's in. He's already been spending tens of millions of dollars in advertising in those 3 swing states we just talked about, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, to try to hang on to them rather than to broaden his support elsewhere. So right now you definitely have to say advantage Biden, but it's a long ways off.
Yeah. So we've got on national polls and average of polls, Biden, 9-10% ahead in most, quite consistently, at least for the last 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a bit longer. But really the campaign hasn't started yet. So the campaign, so you've got your conventions happening over the next few weeks.
Yes.
What would you need to see for that lead to be chipped away? What does Trump need to happen there to...
And what are the conventions going to look like?
Yeah.
Are there going to be any balloons?
Yeah, that's one of the big things, yeah. Under normal times, I could give you the usual strategy, but again, we're not in normal times. I can tell you what's likely to happen, but not completely sure. These conventions are going to have to be online. I mean, the places that they've decided to do them, Houston is an incredible problem with COVID right now. Florida obviously was given as a trial balloon. Probably not going to happen there. President didn't want to have his convention in North Carolina because the governor was going to enforce masking and social distancing. The convention provides a lot of enthusiasm for the base of a party.
Yeah.
You see a lot of like-minded people, and I'm sure, if you watch television shows, the people always seem funnier if there's a laugh track. People always seem more popular if there's people clapping. It makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason people do this, and it does stimulate the base. It also helps to provide, speeches of testimonials from other people in the party saying why this is a great leader, why this person should be reelected. Oftentimes we get to see the next crop of new leaders coming in making a speech for the first time, such as Barack Obama back in 2004. These things are really important and usually are very well watched, especially by independent voters who've yet to make up their minds. We usually see a 5 to 7% bump in the polls after the convention. Traditionally in our system, the out party, that is the party that does not have the presidency, goes first. So that will be the Democrats are first before the Republicans. But both have been pushed back very, very far, and they're going to occur within a week of each other. At least that's how it's scheduled out now, which means I don't know if we'll be able to get that sort of bump. But that might give Trump an advantage because he would go last, and there might not be as much of a bump for Biden. But it's going to be about electronics. And one thing we know about our president is he knows how to use electronic media extremely effectively to distract from things that are going bad and also to promote things that are going well, and simply to get his agenda on the broader media radar. And so in an era of electronic campaigning, we definitely have to give him the advantage there.
Yeah. You have a question?
No,
Okay.
I think that's well answered. I mean, it's just a presidential election without balloons and convention.
Yeah.
It just seems unthinkable, really. But because it's such a part of the tradition in recent times. I think the other thing too is it's interesting that, and you've touched on it, but not only is it at the moment a tough race for the incumbent president, but Republican senators, when you list through the states, the Republicans are fighting to maintain their majority. Where do you have you got an overview that you could give us about the Senate?
Yes, really good question, and I think this is really interesting. If you were to ask me before we had the COVID crisis, were the Democrats going to pick up the Senate, I would say probably not. Now I would say they probably are, and it's looking really strong for them. There are a number of states that have turned around. Some of the states that I'm looking at are Maine, as I said before, North Carolina, Colorado, Arizona, and even Montana. Former governor is running for Senate in Montana, and he's very, very close with the incumbent senator there. They could Democrats could pick off one there. The Democrats are probably going to lose the Alabama Senate seat that they won in the special election to replace Pete Sessions. But the Jeff Sessions, I'm sorry, another Sessions. But I now look at the map and I'm seeing Democrats might pick up, or they might get, or flip the ratio 53-47. Republican as it is right now, pick up about 6 seats and get a 53-47 Democratic. Now, of course, our Senate does have this old rule that it's really hard to get anything done unless you can get to 60 votes, which means you have to peel off some of the other party. There's also questions about whether or not they will retain that old tradition going forward.
Yeah.
But I think the Senate is really important. Here's another reason where I think the tie-in with the presidential election is really important. Vice President Biden right now has a little bit more cash on hand than President Trump does, which is remarkable because President Trump's been has been fundraising ever since he took the oath of office. He's been running for his second term. And Vice President Biden needs to figure out where he wants to target his messages. Does he want to target a place like Ohio where he's not likely to pick up a Senate seat, what we know is a very important swing state? Or is he going to go after someplace like North Carolina, where there's a real good chance that if he gets more people out voting for him, we will have what's called the down ballot effect, which means more people will vote straight ticket for the senator in that race, and that could help turn that. Does the president want to throw his, I just told you, Texas is too close to call right now. Well, Texas is an extremely expensive place to campaign. Very big media markets there. It costs a lot of money to run advertisements. Your marginal returns on spending that money in Texas, probably not, and you don't need it, right? So do you want to say, well, Trump obviously needs Texas, we don't need it. Do we want to force him to compete there and then drain his resources in other places? There's all sorts of Machiavellian strategies that you can game out here. But I think Vice President Biden's going to play it safe because there's the old saying that if your enemy is destroying themselves, stand back and watch, right? Because right now, President Trump is doing really, really poorly. He's really got terrible reviews from in terms of the public approval of his handling of the COVID crisis. He's not nearly seen any of the types of boosts that other national leaders have seen. I think he's really upset about that, but that really hasn't helped him. Right now, Biden nationally is above 50%. Generally, if you're above 50%, that means you're going to win the Electoral College. Now, of course, it goes state by state, so that's not a guarantee. But usually we've seen that trend. It's when somebody wins with less than 50%, as Trump did last time, that all of a sudden the states start getting more fragmented, and you can get somebody who got a minority of the vote, as Trump did. He got 3 million less than Hillary Clinton in terms of the popular vote, but still was able to pull off the electoral vote. So Senate race is important. Also, the other thing that I think is really important to watch in U.S. politics is our state assembly and state Senate races. Our state legislatures are extremely important, especially for what's called the issue of reapportionment. Every 10 years, we reallocate the number of members of the House of Representatives for each state, and because of that, districts have to be redrawn.
Yeah.
Now, because the state legislatures get to do that, they've figured out ways that they can do what we call gerrymandering, which is getting more of a partisan advantage in their state, where they can win more seats even though they have less of an overall vote count in that state by the way that they can cleverly draw the districts. Our Supreme Court has upheld this practice, and right now a majority of those state houses are held by Republicans, as they were after the 2010 elections, which was a big wave for the Republicans. Will the Democrats be able to get those down ticket races and take those state legislature seats? That could impact the U.S. House of Representatives for 10 years to come. So I think that's also something really important to watch.
Are you picking up the background?
Yeah, I am, yeah.
I wonder if
I'm sorry, I'll move this closer to my... Is that better?
It's an American accent, so I wonder if it's coming from your end. There's
another voice
in there.
Yes, my wife's doing a webinar too in the other room. So I apologize.
This is the COVID world we live in, so you shouldn't apologize.
Yes.
So I think one of the in terms of the Senate, they're trying to pass a relief package at the moment. Are you seeing the tightening of the race and the fact that some Republican senators are now more marginal in their position? Are you seeing that playing out in the Senate in terms of the arguments on the relief package?
Sure. The senators are going to have to face their voters and say, well, did I really rack up the national debt in order to recover from this? Or did I help the nation at a time when it needed it? Right. And so whichever way they go, their competitor can really, needle them from either position. Right. So for some of them are in a really difficult position, having to make these decisions, which ostensibly will help, millions and millions of Americans, but and their own voters, but at the same time rack up a lot of debt. So they're really sort of hamstrung right now.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little more around that pathway to victory and you've covered it, but the strategic calls each campaign is going to need to make? Right. It seems clear that Trump must win those 3 Rust Belt states, whereas Biden can patch together something, say, without Wisconsin, or could you talk to us about what the strategic options are there for each campaign?
Yeah, it's kind of fun if you get on some of our websites. Like there's one called 270 to Win, where you can change the color of each of the different states and see how that affects it. But obviously, because our states have different numbers of electoral votes, you can cobble them together in different ways. If you win a big state like Texas, then that's a lot more electoral votes than if you peel off something like, Iowa, or Wisconsin. So I think Donald Trump needs to retain his Rust Belt advantage that he had in 2016. He's not doing it right now from the polling that we're seeing and from some of the other metrics that we do have in the states that we've built into our prediction model. So he's really got to, he's got to get out there and hold Florida. He's got to hold Texas. And he's got to hold those 3 states we talked about earlier, and he's got to hold Ohio. I mean, he didn't win by a whole lot last time, and so he can probably afford to lose a state like Iowa He can probably afford to lose that one electoral vote in Maine because they reapportioned their electors in a different way. He might be able to lose Georgia, but he's going to have to hold on to some of those other states. So right now, Biden's really in the driver's seat, like I said, to pick off which states does he really want to put together to win. And, he's putting together a number of different plans. I think we've seen a number of different ways where the candidates are going to try to appeal to voters specifically. Trump is going to try to make it about Joe Biden. He's going to try to make it a choice. Difficult to do. Earlier this year, he was campaigning on the economy, which was very strong, which is something he really enjoyed touting. He was also talking about how the campaign was good for the Latin and Black populations in the United States. He put an air on our Super Bowl, which is a very expensive thing to do, about that. And just to try to make sure that too many voters didn't peel off and start voting Democratic. We're definitely going to see more strategy from the Democrats to get those voters out in those metropolitan areas to win back those states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I think they think that's the key. Also, some outreach to suburban voters, also important.
All political parties do positive and negative campaigning, and you talked at the beginning about in democracies they do, and you talked in the beginning about the negative partisanship, and which reminds me of that old Groucho Marx song. It doesn't matter what it is, I'm against it. Which is a great song, by the way. So, in terms of voter suppression, from a marketing point of view, how do you see that playing out in this election?
Well, I mean, we saw a lot of it going on during the 2016 election, and some people have attributed the lower voter turnout in those metropolitan areas, especially among the Black community, talking about issues of social justice and how the Clintons really were behind some of these prison get tough on crime issues, and Hillary Clinton really couldn't disentangle herself from that. She wasn't president during the time, she wasn't an office holder, but it really stuck, and it was important for them. But we have another issue that's even more important right now, and that's the issue of police violence. That's what's on everybody's mind. And Vice President Biden has really been good at being sort of the listener, right? The person who has campaigned by saying, I will listen, I am empathetic, I can be the leader who makes things better, whereas President Trump has said over and over again, especially on his Twitter feeds, law and order, right? And so when you act out aggressively against people, that's certainly going to get them to vote. So I think that from a negative campaigning standpoint, President Trump is just doing and saying things that are just helping his base rather than undercutting Vice President Biden right now. I expect that to change. We know that there's been some indication that the president sees Vice President Biden as weak on China. So I think he's going to make that a big issue. I guarantee you're going to see that in the debates come up. I think he's also going to talk about some other issues where he thinks Biden might have some weaknesses, particularly with scandal, with his son, with the Burisma issues. Try to attack him in a way that really cuts into his character. Sort of the way that he cut into Hillary Clinton's character by calling her crooked Hillary and talking about her emails. This is how the president likes to campaign. He likes to make it a choice. Whereas we're going to see Vice President Biden make it a referendum on the 4 years that the president has had. We often hear politicians say, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Certainly that works into Vice President Biden's hands right now. And it's who do you trust to lead the country out of the economic crisis, out of the COVID crisis, and who do you trust to lead on issues of social justice? These are three of the big ones. Right now, Vice President Biden is getting big double-digit leads over the president in terms of the polling we see on that, into the 20s. So that's, I think, the major issues we'll see them campaign on and against one another on.
Yeah. Can I get you to comment on the reliability of polling?
Sure.
Certainly a lot of criticism. In New Zealand, we hear rogue polls as a phrase that's being out there at the moment. But certainly 2016 was surprising to many, and there was a lot of criticism pointed at polling firms and their methodology, and whether or not that's reflecting changes in the electorate, or are they oversampling particular segments of the population? Can you comment on polling?
I can talk a lot about this. Please give me the hook if I'm talking too much.
We'll give you the hand.
Okay, there you go. There's different types of polling. First of all, there's the internal polling that is done by political campaigns. And they have more data with which they have what we call the voter file, which is all the information on every individual in the United States, and it's augmented with consumer purchasing data. It's one of those really huge big data things where you can really target people down to the individual. And you can use that to find out who's going to be a likely voter. And you can do that in a way that is incredibly accurate. Now, the polls that are commissioned by media outlets, those are the ones that we usually consume, the internal polls are not made public. The media polls are the ones that are made public. They use something that's called a likely voter screen. And what that is, it's a set of questions that are asked to voters as to whether or not they're likely to turn out. How enthusiastic are they for each of the candidates? Do they say they want to turn out? Did they turn out last time? Now, using this battery of questions is less accurate to figure out who's going to be voting. Notice I mentioned earlier that Donald Trump activated a lot of new voters, a lot of people who hadn't voted before, who haven't thought about voting before. So that's something that's really important. Also, the timing of polls. It usually takes about 3 days to run an election poll to get into a margin of error that's higher than plus or minus 5%, which, mind you, is a pretty big margin of error still. And the timing of those polls before the election could be a little ways out. Finally, we know that of the people who made up their mind between the last weekend and the Tuesday of the election, they broke 2-1 for President Trump. That was more than enough to cover those margins in those 3 states that we said were really, really important. So are there problems with polling? There certainly are. Fewer and fewer people are taking polls. However, that's actually not true this year. Since the United States has been going into quarantine, and since more people are working at home, people just have less to do and are more likely to partake in the polls. The pollsters are saying that they're getting a much higher response rate this year, which means better data, which means you don't have to weigh it for demographic characteristics. You don't have to weigh it for other things that might be interesting, which increases the error of the poll by doing this weighting. And so they think it's going to be more accurate this time. The other thing is that they often did not weigh by college education last time in 2016. And we found out that there was this group of non-college educated Caucasians who really turned out for President Trump. So that was something that was missed more in the data analysis part rather than the data collection part. So I'm willing to give a little bit more latitude to the pollsters on that. So we know that those last polls, those statewide polls, which aren't particularly accurate because it's smaller samples, usually have a plus or minus 5% margin. Usually we're taking the weekend before the election so that they could run the results before the election. And we know a lot of people made up their minds at the last minute. So there's some reasons why it didn't quite work. But if you look at the 12 states that were the competitive states, it was only of the 24 estimates for Clinton and Biden, there was only, I believe, 2 that were outside the margin of error. Right? It's a big margin of error, and Trump won by a close shave in some very important states. So I don't think it was nearly as bad as a lot of people make it to be. Yeah. And the national polls actually were within the margin of error for the final total, showing Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote nationally.
Yeah. I've heard this idea, actually in New Zealand also, that there's a secret pool of conservative voters in the US. It's Trump voters who, when they talk to pollsters, are embarrassed, I guess, to say they vote for Trump. What do you make of that phenomenon? Is that a real thing?
We call them shy Trump voters, yes. And it looks like there were some of them in 2016. We think that there will be much fewer of them this time because they did come out and vote, and now they're out to defend, and they're very enthusiastic to vote this time around. So I think that group has already been spoken for and now are happy to make their opinions known and are no longer shy about it, right? They realize that others share their opinions. That's why they were shy before. Yeah. And so I think that this will be less of an issue. Also, the pollsters are aware of it as well, so they can adjust their methodologies to deal with that.
Yeah. To our attendees, if you do have questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen there, and either I can enable you to ask the question or I'll ask the question for you. Quite keen on this, the uncertainty created by advanced voting, turnout, mail-in voting. How's that all factored into both polling and campaign strategy? And
also a bit of perspective too on New York's mail-in, which is seen, being touted as a dog's breakfast, and so is that going to play out?
And have they finished counting yet?
Yeah,
that's a metaphor I'm not aware of. Dog's breakfast.
Well, just a real mess. Like, how's that? The dogs make a mess of their breakfast.
Okay, I got you. That one was lost over the Pacific somewhere. Obviously, there's been problems. Georgia's had really bad problem with the casting and counting of their votes. It's going to be really difficult, and a lot of the elections offices, our Constitution leaves it to our states. And so the elections offices in the states are traditionally underfunded institutions. Politicians don't put a whole lot of money into them because you don't get to cut new ribbons. You don't get to go out and have I'm bringing home the money to my district because look at what I did. Ooh, voting. It's not the grandest thing for people to be able to talk about when they want to bring jobs home, because they aren't long-term jobs. A lot of them are very short-term. The issue is going to be extremely thorny, and I'm very, very concerned about how thorny it can get. And there's a number of reasons for this. As I said before, the states run their elections, and they all do it in a different way. They rely on volunteers, well, not really volunteers, they're paid, but people who do this over and over again generally tend to be older individuals, people who are more at high risk for COVID, who may not want to show up on election day. So staffing is going to be a big problem, trying to backfill in some potential losses there. Making sure people stay 6 feet apart when they're casting their ballots. Making sure that there are enough ballots printed and sent out in a timely manner is going to be a big issue. And we've already seen our president cast doubt on mail-in ballots, although there's really very, very little information, or very little scientific information that there is much malfeasance that happens there. The only thing is what's called voter harvesting, where candidates go out and pick up the ballots for you and turn them in to the elections officials. And that turned one race in North Carolina, but they found out about it and they had to redo the election. Most states don't allow that. So that's an issue. It's going to come down to resources in the states, and the longer it gets drawn out, the longer they're counting absentee ballots, the less likely it's going to be that President Trump concedes the election if he is on the losing end. As he said, he hasn't committed to losing. So I do worry about the peaceful transfer of power, and I directly correlate that to the state's ability to pull off an election in this pandemic time, which I think is incredibly fraught with difficulty.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions through. One from Sam McIver, one of our board members and Chief Executive of Beef and Lamb NZ, and he says, does policy actually matter in US elections? And aside from COVID-related policy, what are the three top policy issues, and will they make a difference this time around?
Great question. Thank you for asking that, Sam. The biggest issue in almost all elections is the economy. And that couldn't be a bigger issue right now. As I was saying, our House and Senate are trying to put together another stimulus bill that will increase the amount of direct cash payments to individuals, and also include some more unemployment insurance payments. So putting food on the table is really important. That's usually a number one issue. Who do you trust to manage the economy? Who do you trust to manage a recovery? Joe Biden's going to be able to say, hey, I was with Barack Obama when we recovered from the Great Recession, and I am the person who has the leadership and skills to do that. He's going to start floating some names of people that might be in his cabinet, that might be Treasury Secretary and such, and these individuals can give confidence to people about how he's going to govern. So I think that's the number one issue is going to be the economy. COVID, I think, is certainly going to be there, probably number one and 1A, because they're very much related.
Yeah.
The president has hurt himself on that issue. Other issues, I still think that issue of police violence in the United States is going to be a recurring one. It hasn't gone away, mostly because of the missteps of the administration, the overreach in using federal troops to pull people off the street in unmarked cars and unmarked uniforms has really kept this in the public agenda. There's going to be a very big march on Washington, D.C. for the Black Lives Matter movement at the end of August. They are determined to keep this in the public agenda for a long time. So I don't think that one's going away, where usually civil rights issues have a tendency to pop up and go back down very quickly in our country. I think that the leaders in this issue are really determined to keep it around. So other issues I think will be related to the economy. I think China is going to be a huge issue. Right? This was a big issue for President Trump to get elected. Right? I'm going to be tough on China. I'm going to bring back jobs. Jobs have been lost due to, they've been lost due to automation and to China, but also he said we're going to rebuild. That hasn't happened. Vice President Biden has issued a platform for rebuilding and building crucial structures in the United States so that we're not dependent upon a nation like China to build our protective gear and our masks and everything like that we can't even seem to produce at home anymore. We've become far too dependent. So I think international trade will be a big one. And don't forget immigration. That is what President Trump ran on before. He will run on it again. He will say, I've started building this wall. There's some miles of it that have gone up. I'm going to elect me again, and I will fulfill this promise. I think that's one that he always sees as being one that can get people out and motivated when they might not be motivated otherwise. So I would say those four, I think, are going to be pretty good issues. I think that the climate policy that Vice President Biden put out probably will get attacked by President Trump. I think that might open him up because it is a very ambitious program. So far, the Vice President has put out 42 different policies on his website about what he plans to do. Whenever you put out policy specifics, somebody's ox is going to get gored. Somebody's going to be able to perceive their losses in it. And so I think that some of those details, I think the President will use that to his advantage to go after specifics in the Biden plan and to talk more in generalities and promises kept to the extent he can on his side.
Yeah. You have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, so the law and order thing, is that working for Trump? Because he's going very long on that issue at the moment.
He has, and it's actually turned against him. Right now, when it comes to dealing with this issue, Vice President Biden is getting higher marks. So it hasn't really worked for him. The missteps have been pretty phenomenal. The issue of gassing the protesters so he could have a photo op in front of a church in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., and then later that night seeing the White House shrouded in darkness, right, and the president in his bunker. This is made for TV attack ads, right? And so I mean I don't think the president has done himself really any benefit in there. It's going to be difficult for him to try to say things will be worse under a Biden administration when things aren't quite peaceful right now under his administration.
Yeah. One of the questions we've got come through, and it's a question I was quite interested in too, was this idea of a fundamental realignment in the electoral
Oh, yes.
map. And, but, there's been talk of that for a while, that, that's been happening. So you have Midwest moving, I guess, slightly more Republican, and then South and Southwest moving more heavily Democratic. So do you agree? Is that process of realignment happening? What stage is it at? And because that stage, having a gauge on where it's at, it has, campaign implications, right? You put too much focus on Arizona at this stage, but it's not quite ready yet to go blue. So some comments on that realignment.
And of course, that question from Eden Hoppener in the New Zealand Embassy in Washington, D.C.
All right. Well, thank you for that question, Aaron. Love this question. I love following the demographic trends, which I think is what you're asking about. I also want to touch on what's called party realignment, which is another type of realignment that I think is also occurring at this time, which I think is really interesting. So, excuse me. Definitely the demographics have been shifting against the Republicans. The nation is becoming less white, and like I said, the Latin populations are increasing, and that helps Democrats. Republicans, after the 2012 election, commissioned a report to see why couldn't they win in 2012. Why did Romney have a difficult time? They called it the post-mortem report on the 2012 election. And they said, what we need to do from here going out is we can't be the party of old white men. We have to reach out to minority groups that are expanding at a quicker clip than the rest of the country. We need to find candidates who can speak to them. We need to find candidates who can talk about issues in the way that younger people want to hear these issues talked about, and demographics that are not traditionally in the Republican fold. And then they nominated Donald Trump, who did exactly the reverse. He went full culture war during the campaign. He violated Republican orthodoxy on free trade and made it more about protectionism, which certainly was very difficult. They wanted to get back to their core conservative values, and Donald Trump, frankly, didn't comport with some of those. So we've seen this demographic shift that spells trouble for the Republican Party, and they have not yet really addressed it, at least at the top levels. I mean, they have some more diverse candidates at the Senate and the House levels and in the state legislatures. Somebody like Marco Rubio, they thought would be the type of person who could win in 2016, could do those things that I spoke about, speaking to those younger voters and voters of color. Other types of redistribution going on demographically in the United States that is extremely important is what we call self-sorting. And that is, people in the rural areas are becoming more Republican. People in the urban areas are becoming more Democratic. And people are actually leaving some areas and going to others to be around the people who are more like-minded. This is part of our very hyper-partisan situation we have going on here in the United States now. And so that is part of it. Now, there was a big flocking to the cities of younger people and minorities, and now people are leaving the cities because of COVID. So I think that's going to be very, very interesting to see how that plays out in this election and how that might affect strategy. And the last sort of realignment that I would talk about is party realignment, and that is the president is the head of his party. Sorry to use the gender term there. We haven't had a female president here yet. Generally, you see this sort of idea of political time where a president puts together a new sort of coalition which is able to keep that party in power, or at least very competitive, for a prolonged period of time. What the Republicans are operating under now is what we call the Reagan coalition. The groups of union or former union people who were able to vote for Reagan on the basis of other issues, law and order, foreign policy, other issues that he was able to crack some of these strong Democratic voters and bring them over to his side. One of the things political scientists are wondering is this sort of Reagan coalition falling apart? It's not as ideological as it was before, with Trump at the head of the ticket, as I was talking about, with trade, with foreign policy issues, not following sort of a strong Reagan doctrine internationally. And what's going to come up to replace it? Are the Republicans going to continue on with somebody like Trump who, let's face it, he caught lightning in a bottle. He caught fire in 2016. People really didn't think he was going to be that particularly competitive, but people liked what they were hearing from him. That sort of brash style, the style was a big part of it. Are we going to see people in the like of him, or are people going to try to rebuild that Reagan coalition? Or are they going to reach out and do what we talked about with this postmortem and try to broaden the Republican Party to include persons of color and younger voters to a greater degree than it does right now? So those are some of the trends that I'm looking for.
Can you talk a bit about the reliability of the results, and particularly around cybersecurity concerns and quite a established Russian playbook around creating chaos in democratic nations and in their voting processes. So where is the US at in terms of securing that process?
We have one advantage for us, which is that big disadvantage that I gave you earlier, is that we leave it to the states, right? So it's not like we have one single repository of votes that can be tampered with and easily changed, right? It's diffused, right? It's like, an investment portfolio. It's all over the place. If something happens in one place, then you have some other place where you can maintain. But that being said, those states have fewer resources, and they've gotten some resources from the federal government to provide more security, but not nearly what they need, not nearly what the elections experts are saying. We know that the Russian, the GRU, they actually pinged each of the different electronic resources of each of the states. We call them their clerks and offices of elections and secretaries of state. Each state calls it something different. But they actually got in to those systems. They did not change any votes. They didn't cause any harm. There was nothing malicious. But it was sort of like they were telling us, we can do this if we want to, right? And so we know they have the capability. And this is one of the things that I think keeps a lot of elections security experts up at night, because the United States the federal government has not given the resources to the state governments to really harden these sites and to prevent something like that from happening.
Yeah.
So it is concerning.
Yeah. So we're about 5 minutes to go. So any final questions, please send them through via the Q&A function.
I do have a question,
which
is the headline from 2018, the midterms, was, suburbans turned against President Trump. And how do you factor that in terms of it as a trend, and does it portend anything in this coming presidential election in 100 days' time?
I think that's one of the reasons President Trump just the other day said that if Vice President Biden is elected, the suburbs will be burned, right? And they will never look like what they looked like before. He just tweeted this out yesterday, I believe it was. Or was it today? The days are getting a little confusing for me.
Yeah.
But so much happens so quickly.
It's 2020.
It sure is. He's trying to turn those suburbs back to him. They have been trending the other way. One election is not a trend, right? 2018, they went one way in 2016. They went back the other way in 2018. And 2018 was a lower turnout election because it was an off-year election, as we call them, midterm election. So we will have higher turnout. So to see if we get 2 data points out of this, then we can establish that it's a trend. But one, I don't think is enough.
Right.
Do we have another final question?
We do have a question coming in from Suzanne Snively. We're just trying to locate it.
Some difficulty because it's gone to my email. And I've shut down emails just so I don't have them pinging up. So maybe, Suzanne, if you could pop it into the Q&A, that would be great. So you're an expert on leadership and the presidency. And I guess from New Zealand, it's interesting to observe you have the two candidates are male, 70 plus, white. How do you explain that when you have been talking about this realignment that's happening, and
here's how we explain it, and this is pretty easy to explain. The number one concern of the Democratic Party voters when they voted in the nomination was who has the best chance to beat Trump. That's all they cared about. We can put the diversity on hold for another 4 years. The big thing is beating Trump. We had the most diverse crop of any presidential nomination campaign on the Democratic side this year. Several women of color, and obviously people wanted the safe choice. They also wanted somebody who could rebuild that Obama coalition, which was very successful. It's going to take a while, but we do have the guarantee, and we'll probably get his pick next week sometime, that Vice President Biden will be choosing his vice presidential nominee. She will be a woman. Most people think it will be a woman of color, especially considering the issues of racial justice that are so prominent right now. So we'll get one. It's highly likely that Vice President Biden will be a one-term president if elected. He's even intimated as such. He's 77 years old. So the vice president will really be in the driver's seat for the nomination in 2024. So it might not be off as far in the future as we think.
All right. Okay, so Suzanne has sent the question through. It's a great question too. So the president said last night and just called a press conference to say that the election should be delayed because of COVID and the unreliability of postal voting, which may delay the vote count. Mitch McConnell said the election stays the same. Under what authority does the president think he can change the election date? Good question. Yeah.
Zero authority. The president has no authority to do this. Election date was established by an act of Congress signed by the president. It can only be undone by another act of Congress, which would change it and then be signed by the president. But if you don't even have the majority leader signing on to this in one chamber, and the chamber is controlled by the opposite party, you're not going to get that. The other way would be a Supreme Court emergency injunction. I don't think that's likely to happen. One of the reasons why that wouldn't happen is because when it comes to issues of politics playing out, the Supreme Court likes the politics to play out in the political arena. They do not like to stick their necks into it. The big exception being 2000 when they decided that election, but at that point somebody had to. But we're far enough out where it's not like that.
Oh, yeah. We've seen elections that haven't been called immediately, and the Gore and Bush election is a classic of its case, and it involves a lot of lawyers and time in court. And we with postal voting and delays that we may see that. Perhaps it would be, I have it a sense, but it would be good to recap. If there is no ability to call the election, what does the Constitution require, and who's going to be the president?
Okay. Well, there's a number of steps that have to take place, right? And I've also sort of gamed this out with others about what if one of these septuagenarians that we have running for office was to pass between now and then, right? And who becomes president?
Well, Herman Cain died just yesterday.
Herman Cain just died. Yes, exactly. So these are important questions, and if it is not, we've got about 4 weeks to get it right, and that's usually going to be enough time. The electors don't meet until the first Sunday in their respective states, and then they cast their electoral votes there. Those are then transmitted to the U.S. Senate, where the president of the Senate, who is the Vice President Pence, then reads the results of the election on January 3rd.
Right.
So we're talking 2 months away. So there's a lot of time to get it right between now and then, and I don't think we'll have a problem.
Yeah. Wow, I think we've reached the top of the hour, and my goodness, we've covered quite a lot, and it's been incredibly insightful, and I think helpful at this end for us to understand the process and the thinking that's going on, and some of the campaign the campaign teams, and what their considerations are, and where that all might lead. You have any final comments there?
Yeah, as a political junkie, I just feel like I got my fix, So I think, Todd, that was a fantastic effort. And also a shout out to two students, probably of yours, Julian Rubel and Matthew Galbart at George Washington, good friends of my son Connor.
All right.
And so I'll talk to them and check out how they rate your classes. So we'll get a poll result for you on that as well.
Love that. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, under normal circumstances, I'd say tell them to come by my office, but I'm not there right now. So.
Well, you're in a bigger office at the moment.
So thank you very much, Todd.
And
Thanks so much.
have a lovely evening.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Have
so
a
much.
good morning.
Yeah,
Take care.
cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.